A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Listeners from all around the world. I think we've even got a couple of people from Australia joining, which I think shows commitment indeed. And of course, a huge welcome and thank you to Stan and Jane for joining us to talk about building the Ministry for the Future. So, a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Kat Tully and I'm moderating the conversation today, and it's a particular pleasure for me to do so, not just because these two people are heroes of mine and have got fabulously interesting things to say because it's very topical, but also because I think that there's an opportunity now to actually act on their ideas in a way that we haven't been able to before. So not only is the conversations about building back better post-COVID, really thinking about how do we make sure that these investments that we're going to make stop us from, help us to address the existential and climate crises that face us and make sure that we stop colonizing and dumping harms upon those next generations coming ahead whose voices are not heard in decision-making today. So how do we address that? And there are interesting seeds of change that we see around us, whether it's New Zealand and Scotland and Iceland talking about well-being economics, whether it's the OECD talking about going beyond GDP, whether it's the new innovations in institutions like the EU's Ministers for the Future, the things that are happening in Wales or the Sri Lankan constitution, or even just this week with the Dasgupta review on biodiversity, and the court case around the duty of care around climate crises that the Australian young citizens have brought out. This is all incredibly relevant today. And what seems to be underlying it all is how do we address this tragedy of the time horizon, as Stan puts it so nicely? How do we represent the interests of future citizens when making decisions today? And we couldn't have two better people to help us navigate this dilemma than the two here. So we're incredibly lucky to have a hero of mine, Kim Stanley Robinson, needs no introduction, science fiction writer extraordinaire, joining us from the West Coast, weaver of tales of the future, both far and near. And he's going to be talking to us about his new book, The Ministry of the Future. And I'm very sad that in a COVID world, I can't get a physical signature, but it shall happen soon. Now, when we were talking to Stan a few months ago about let's do something because this is so important, people are really hungry for insights from your book, we were like, the best person to put him with is someone who, again, we hugely value and think is inspiring and is effectively a real world Mary Murphy, the protagonist of the book. And that's Jane Davidson, who's actually been doing this stuff for the past 20 years, and most importantly, has got real success in Wales as the minister driving through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And she talks about that in her book, Futuregen Tales from a Small Country. And basically, however, what she does is convene a network of people like us, activists who believe that we can make change happen through institutions and policymaking today. So I guess I will probably say very little in the rest of the conversation, but apart from steering this, but what I will do is I'll just say that this is a conversation not just about these by these two fabulous people, but also you on the call as well. We've got amazing people on the call, citizens who are doing wonderful things in your communities, in your government. So we want to hear from you. So my role will be to try and bring your voice into the conversation, your comments and your questions. And I'm really looking forward to the hour that we have together. So thank you, Stan and Jane, for joining us. I'll probably ask you, Stan, first. Tell us a little bit about the Ministry for the Future. What were the kind of key messages that you wanted people to take out from that book?
Well, thanks for that, Kat, and thanks for having me. Good to be with Jane. It's really inspirational to me. I wrote the Ministry for the Future at the end of a long career of writing utopian novels, but never coming right at the current crisis facing all of us. So I decided to face it head on. And recent findings about wet bulb 35 temperatures a combination of heat and humidity, that the global warming that we're creating by our carbon burn is very quickly going to put us into heat waves that will endanger the lives of, say, a third of humanity. So we can't really go on as we're going on. Then also to add to that, we live in a capitalist world, neoliberal global capitalism, globalization. Capital is invested at the highest rate of return. That is the working law of our economic system. Decarbonizing fast is not the highest rate of return because it's enormously expensive, and yet there isn't a profit to be made from it. It's more saving the planet. It's just not the most profitable thing in our economic system. So it's not going to get done. So that was the situation I was thinking over when I thought, well, what would have to happen if we were to actually scrape through the next few decades and not create a mass extinction event and heat waves that would kill millions? And so that led me, I have to say, to finance and to the central banks because of this basic economic problem that we're not going to pay ourselves to do the right things in the current economic order. And I don't think it's possible to reinvent everything from scratch. I mean, we live in the institutions that we're in, and it takes time, as Jane can tell us, to make significant change. So there's a notion going around, and this is the crucial thing for my book, carbon quantitative easing. We know what quantitative easing is because of 2008 and because of 2020's pandemic. The central banks can make new money from scratch. That's what it comes down to. If it were aimed in its first makings to only decarbonizing efforts, to switch out our infrastructures and everything else so that we were in a carbon neutral or even carbon negative world, and we were getting paid to do that. So it isn't, it doesn't have to be volunteer or virtuous or suffering, but merely civilization paying itself to do good things for the biosphere rather than bad things. So there's my plot. I can leave it at that. The novel is long and complicated in the usual way, but I've given you the basics of my train of thought there as to how it came about. And and I guess I should add the Paris Agreement, which is 2015, the same year as Jane's Ministry for the Future Act in Wales. So something was going on in 2015, the culmination of a long process. And the Paris Agreement is the mechanism I decided by which the international nation state community could begin to work out this giant global problem. So that's how I came to my own fictional Ministry for the Future as an agency of the Paris Agreement.
Fabulous. So Jane, you also recently published a book. What are the key messages in that book?
Well, I fundamentally believe that the decisions of governments and public authorities should, by law, factor in their impacts on future generations. And that just seems to me an unassailable proposition. But we know that in reality, politics is conducted in the short term, often the very short term. And we're now paying the climate and biodiversity consequences. And I just believe that if we did adopt this approach more in individual countries or through the UN, it would fundamentally change the way decisions are made. So my book is the story of one small country, Wales, the smallest country in mainland UK, 3 million people, 10 million sheep, and the experiment in Wales to actually deliver sustainable development in all its actions. And over a period of time, the government tried to do that without having specific legislation, which then led to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which Stan has mentioned in 2015. What was extraordinary when I was asked to write the book as the minister who first proposed the architecture for this act was to find out that not only was Wales the first in the world to put future generations into law by passing this act, but it was also the first country in the world, and not even a member state, to put the Sustainable Development Goals into law. And this struck me as highly problematic when we think about the challenges facing us. And just for people who are not aware of the legislation, I'll put a link in the chat later, but the law requires delivery on 7 goals, including, for example, redefining prosperity as low carbon and regenerating nature. And it also requires 5 ways of working to be preventative, collaborative, think long term, integrate the goals and involve people about whom decisions are made. And it's probably just worth saying at the moment, because there will be definitely a question in the chat, well, what has it done? Is, what it has meant, for example, is that the Welsh Government has legislated for public bodies to be zero carbon by 2030. It's outlawed smacking. It's enabled young people 16 and over to vote. It's refused permission for a motorway to destroy an internationally designated wetland. It's among the 3 best recycling countries in the world, and actually was best at one point in 2020. And it's introducing a circular economy, removing all waste to landfill in the next few years. It's changing its education curriculum. So there's a whole range of things that are being done because this is about society, the economy, the environment, and the culture of the country. And it is a quiet revolution from a small country. It's always hard to get noticed as a regional government. But through the book, I'm trying to shout out about it because it offers 20 years of evidence of what works and what doesn't work when trying to deliver systems change. And there are 140 voices from across the world contributing. And I just wonder whether at this point, Kat, as you were saying in your introduction, at this time, that actually thinking about using future generations as a frame will help people get beyond some of those partisan issues around climate.
That's lovely, Jane. And in fact, it's like, what comes through really clear in both your books is the importance of rule of law. And I think there's something really interesting about the SDGs happening in 2015. Stan, you also, like, it's interesting, you talk about so many different actors in the book, but at the same time, you're really clear about the role of nation states in driving change. And for example, you go quite a lot into Switzerland and India. Can you talk a little bit about, in the arc of the book, how you see kind of positive change happening from some of those nation states and how that might happen?
Yeah, sure. We're in a nation state system and we have a crisis that is bearing down on us so fast that we've, as we've been warned, we've got a decade or two to decarbonize fast. And so I had to, everybody has to imagine it happening within the already existing nation state system. So one thing you have to look at is the petrostates, the ones that have a whole lot of fossil fuels within their national borders that they control. And I have to point out that 80% of the fossil fuels that have been located are under the control of national governments. It's not private corporations, even though those oil companies are big. They're nowhere near as big as the governments of Russia, Canada, the United States, Brazil, Australia, Mexico, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and perhaps India. So, and China. And these big countries also being petrostates, and maybe it's not a coincidence, but in any case, they have to agree to sequester the fossil fuels that they already have. That stuff has to stay in the ground, even though it's worth like $1,600 trillion if priced at current oil prices. So an accommodation has to be made by way of international agreement and by everybody agreeing to stand down without any kind of zero-sum game infighting, although naturally that's going to happen. Many countries are going to try to burn the last trillion or two before the whole thing shuts down. So it's an enormous fight there. So then small countries, I think what happens is, especially small, developed, and you might say coherent countries, thinking of the United States as incoherent, well, they can serve as models and exemplars, and they can band together. And this is where Jane's country, Wales, can serve. Now, when everybody talks about there should be future generations included in rule of law and calculated in the economic calculations and the laws, one can always say, well, it's done in Wales. And then it becomes a model for everybody else to look at and say, well, how did that work and how's it going? It's the same, for instance, the Constitution of Ecuador. a small country in South America, but it has its forests is a citizen and has rights in the Ecuadorian constitution. These exemplary actions serve as models for the big scrum that's coming up.
So Stan, like, you come from this angle from a fiction writer perspective. Jane, you're someone who's written about your experience. Stan, what did you see in Jane's book that kind of really inspired you or really noticed, kind of struck you?
Well, there was a lot. I really enjoyed Jane's book. There's, first of all, the background and just personal experiences, how what your parents teach you is really important in terms of your values. And then chance encounters as you go through childhood and youth that kind of boggle your mind, like things should be just. These things that occur to you when you're a child and then drive your career. That to me was quite beautiful, and really it's what novels are always trying to do. Come back to individual moments of being and of realization of the world that we're in, and then to try to act in it. Well, this is where Jane is quite amazing, in that really a whole career has been devoted to a project, but also there were many steps along the way. It was a 30-year haul of perpetual efforts. And so I mean, there's some things completely cracked me up. Minister makes children play in the rain as a headline. I mean, that's something to stick on your wall for sure, because that's a good thing to have done. And then something that made me laugh quite a lot is life makes sense looking backwards. And this explained a lot to me because my whole writing life has been looking forwards. So it's never made any sense to me. And I had to kind of ponder that statement for a while and think, well, what have I been doing except be confused, which I have been. But the trick of science fiction is to, and Jane does this in her book also, go out to 2050, go out to 2070, look back. So then like life makes sense looking backwards. Then 2020 begins to make sense from the perspective of the future. So this is what I've been doing. And then what it helped me to comprehend the kind of the arc of Jane's book. And I guess I'll end by saying rule of law, that one realization comes along that this can't just be advisory. It can't be something that is maybe in America, an executive pronouncement that then can be overturned by the next administration, by the next government. If it's legislated and if it's in the law, then all the rest of government has to abide by it. And unless they happen to manage to overthrow that law, which is relatively rare, it sticks and stands. So that's something that I saw in Jane's book that reaffirmed my feeling that we're in what Raymond Williams called the long revolution. And possibly long revolutions are better because they aren't so violent. They don't have the blowback. And really they're the best way going forwards is to just keep chewing away at the problem. So that's what I loved in Jane's book.
Thanks. And there's a question actually about the law that someone's posted around, at what point can we move beyond perhaps the law, or do we kind of go beyond this division between law and culture, and can we kind of internalize the intrinsic responsibility of caring for the future? Perhaps, Jane, your views on that would be great, but also what did you get from engaging with Stan's book that goes from a 2040 time horizon looking back?
Well, just picking up at that first point about making this intrinsic, I think one of the real opportunities of the way the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is constructed, because it deals with all those issues around environment, society, economy, and culture for me is the most important one, because it is actually both around sort of culture, language, heritage, but it's also about behavior change. And I see the law as permission to think differently. The law oddly enough for a law, does not have substantial penalties within it. It has a number of guardians around it, a Future Generations Commissioner who's independent, an audit office, the Welsh Government, and ultimately the courts. But the idea that actually the law gives you permission to behave intrinsically differently, I think is really important in this particular context. And I think that in fact this reflects back to me what partly what Stan was saying about my book. I feel some similar elements about his. I mean, I loved it, by the way. I loved the mix of science and literature. I loved the creation of some characters, quite sketchily in some places, quite complete in others. I love the fact that actually it's not just people who have a voice in the book, but I'll leave those to read it to see what else has a voice. But we were writing about the same time frames, the action needed before 2050 and the best case scenarios. And that's very short term in the context of humanity, but it is still unbelievably long term for usual policy development and usually left to the last moment. And we were writing about some of the same value systems. Stan has just talked now about the rule of law, and he explicitly says legislation does it in the end. And for me, legislation is very important because it is enduring. And just as an executive order may not last longer than one administration, of course, policies don't last longer than administration. But I think it'll be much harder in the current climate for people to repeal a piece of legislation that actually looks after both current and future generations' interests alongside each other. Mm-hmm. I love the fact that despite both of us being strong advocates of the rule of law, we both recognise the failure of the current systems and ways of working to deliver, and how much is rhetoric rather than action. And you said at the beginning, Kat, that in many ways, I'm a sort of Mary Murphy figure, and I certainly identified with her doubts and frustrations. For those who've not read it yet, Mary is the main protagonist. She was an Irish diplomat, and she's now running the UN agency called the Ministry for the Future. And she's always up against those determined to retain business as usual. I have definitely been there. I feel as though I've been there most of my life. But ultimately, we do both share a view of hope that a good global response will dodge a mass extinction event. And there's near the end of the book, I think actually in one of the last couple of pages, Stan says, "There is no other home for us than here, that we will cope, no matter how stupid things get, that the only catastrophe that can't be undone is extinction, that we can make a good place, that people can take their fate in their hands, that there is no such thing as fate." And I just felt that it's almost as though some of my thought processes, Stan has taken away and done something quite extraordinary, because his brain is much bigger than mine, and he's delivered it to many more people by using fiction allied to fact. And it's that fiction and science interface that I think makes his book so wonderful.
And you're totally right. I mean, Stan, you weave together the most amazingly different strands, whether it's the anger around student debt, around what's going to happen post-Facebook, neo-African independence renaissance, what it feels like to be in a 35-degree wet bulb moment, how it is to kind of be boiled alive. So your ability to kind of weave this together, all these complicated issues, and make it personal and emotional and connect is so powerful. And I think that does speak to the kind of power of literature in generating and creating change. And quite a few of the questions that we've got coming up actually speak to this, which is, how can we make it even more effective, literature in driving policy change? How do we use literature to kind of help people identify the seeds of change around them so they can imagine a different future? I guess, Dan, the question to you is, what is it that literature can do that non-fiction can't in driving change? And how could we be harnessing that in this moment of opportunity?
Well, thanks for that, and thank you, Jane, for your kind words. It means a lot to me because I am a novelist, and literature is, in a sense, my religion. In that it's the way that I make meaning out of the world, and everybody has to have a meaning out of the world, or else they're stupendously disabled. And so you make your meaning out of stories that you tell yourself or that you hear and believe in. And so novels are one way to do that. We all take in scores of stories a day. We're addicted to them. And the novel is one of the carrying mechanisms for the stories that we're addicted to. And I quite love it. And it's fun to try. Um, I guess I want to use a science fiction analogy here. Novels give you, and literature in general, they give you two things that you don't usually get. Time travel, because you get to go to other times and places. What was it like in Rome when Rome burned down? Well, you read a novel and you're there for a while. So you get time travel. And that can exist in the future too. You go to the moons of Jupiter in the year 3000. So that's time travel. Then also, crucially, you get telepathy. You get to know what someone else is thinking and even experience it as if you were that person. Now, this is a fictional experience of telepathy, but nevertheless quite real because readers are very generous. Readers are doing a creative thing when they read. They're taking in those sentences and imagining it from their own perspective. Oh, yes, that's how I would feel. Oh, yes, I think that too. And the combination of what you already know and have thought yourself with these new thoughts organized into the characters in a novel, it can be like a real experience, at least a waking dream. I say that people who love to read fiction get to live 10,000 lives rather than one because of these fictional experiences being quite dramatic and intense. That's how I experience it as a reader. That's what I try for as a writer. So these scenarios, we're thinking about the near future. What would it feel like if you were in a heat wave? If you managed to pass a treaty that really enacted the best impulses of our political system, what would that feel like? And so this is what you can experience through literature, and it's fictional, but it's important.
What's your view on that, Jane?
I think that I've got three points really. I am an English literature graduate. I am a voracious reader of fiction. I absolutely love it. And what I particularly loved about your book and others that do this is where you have fictional characters in a kind of real scenario, where the real scenario enables us to understand the behavior of the characters in that context. And then of course, we're sitting there thinking, oh, I don't think they behaved like that in the 1980s. I think that person's got their timeline wrong. But not in your case, I say. But I think there's the if you just look at the fact, I mean, my book as somebody who's never written before, this is my first book, in a country which normally only makes the news in the context of size of whales, if you want to describe things like wind farms or the loss of forests or things, then actually the reach of a non-fiction book is relatively small. And the reach of fiction, particularly from an established writer, is very, very large. And I think that where fiction can be used to make a really important political point, which I think Stan does really well, that's a way of enhancing the debate in ways that brings it to all sorts of other people who would never otherwise have any access to that territory. I think it's also about how your imagination is captured. I mean, Kat, you described the awfulness of the tragedy that starts the book, the people who effectively are boiled alive because the lake is of a higher temperature than their body temperature. And it is such an image that I was in tears reading that within the first few pages of the book. And we know that fear doesn't drive action. We know that actually people have floods and hurricanes, and I thought, and Donella Meadows, who influences me so much, I mean, she used to say as a scientist that she thought when governments and people understood the science of what was happening, they'd take action. But actually, oddly enough, I mean, and we've seen the floods this year in Wales, we've seen the wildfires in Australia, etc. And what we're seeing is more people saying, thank goodness they're not living in those areas where that has happened. And I think that we have to turn this round and talk about optimism. And the real advantage of literature is you can almost create modern fairy tales of resilience and redemption and epiphanies. And I talk about the epiphanies that have happened to me in my book, and I'm interested that they resonated with Stan as well. But epiphanies are born out of both wonder and frustration. And they're partly when the narratives that you're struggling to construct are said better by others. And I think that's the real advantage of literature in this context, is that, you know, people who successfully engage an audience with fiction have a way with words that I would never be able to achieve, or a reach that I would never be able to have. But if those of us who believe in how we can get to that different kind of future from a different kind of system can come together, I think that we will win. We have to.
Stan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I want to say that it takes everything. And what I admire in Jane's book, and what nonfiction can do, is to say, this really happened. And it has the power of testimony, of a real life set down in a way that is compelling to read about. And it really, and quite amazing, the long march from one step to the next, that it, in fact, if you tried to do that in a novel, you would be perhaps having to A, look implausible, and B, perhaps take 10,000 pages. The long march is long, and it's nonfiction that can lay it out as this really happened. So that means it can happen. It isn't just a utopian wish, which has kind of been my game. It's an actual record of things really done in the world that made a difference. And also the possibility of a blueprint set out plainly, which, you know, in a novel, this is kind of the rap against utopias, is that someone guides you around and shows you how the sewage system works and the recycling works and how government passes its bills. And of course, utopias are intensely boring because they're meant to describe something going wrong. But in nonfiction, you can actually do that blueprint and say, look, if we did X, Y, and Z, we would get to the good place, and this is how it can be achieved. So there's a question of praxis, the how-to question of, okay, I want the world to be better for my children and for the generations to come. How do I do that, given where we are now? And we are in quite a nasty fix. Well, this is where it's possible to go to a book like Jane's and learn lessons that can be turned to use. And this was Dr. Johnson, you know, Dictionary Johnson, Samuel Johnson, 18th century. What's good in literature, and he meant all of it, is what can be put to use. And so this is what I think really is the great power of Jane's book and of the genre of nonfiction, is reality itself, and also use value. You can put this book to use, and then you can change your place too. It's very important.
There's something very powerful about this kind of the partnership of the aspirational as envisaged and the reality as experienced that comes out from this conversation. I want to kind of pick up a couple of questions, 3 questions that actually kind of, because you're effectively both kind of perhaps pragmatic optimists about whether change will happen. And there's a set of questions that are touching on that point about, you know, first of all, it's around, you know, there are a growing number, says Oliver, of kind of more utopian post-climate catastrophe novels. Is this indicative of an appetite for changing the world? And John's asking, you know, absolutely, values is absolutely really important. And that's, you know, the direction of travel of values is indicative of what's going to happen in the future. But do you feel that values in society are moving in the right direction, or are we becoming more selfish? And a kind of similar question in that vein is from Svetla, which is very frankly, you know, will humans be able to adapt by design, or is it going to have to be from dealing with disasters? So any kind of thoughts on this kind of set of questions around how change is going to end up happening in reality in this complex world of ours? Perhaps back to you, Stan, first.
Well, it's this gets into questions of human nature. You know, are we fundamentally selfish? Are we altruistic? Are we smart? Are we stupid? Well, it's an ongoing improvisation, and so you don't want to get into essential philosophical definitions. Humans are like this, humans are like that. We'll find out by doing it. So I think that what you see is that young people, I mean, in America, we have this term that's replaced the proletariat, the precariat. Everyone's feeling precarious. They're not in a social democracy. They don't have good health insurance. They don't have any job security. They don't have any retirement plan. They don't have anything. They're precarious. One accident or job loss or catastrophe, and they're financially ruined for life. So there's a huge, almost desperate urge for something different and something better. And there are models around the world in the social democracies of something that is better. So then it becomes a political battle. And this combination of values, I mean, really, Kat, at some point we need to turn this around and have you tell us about what you've been doing with these efforts to make the European Union include the kind of thing that Jane has done in Wales. I wonder if we're at a sort of tipping point in world history, that the dangers feel so present. Everybody knows things have to change. They're looking for ways to change. And you must be seeing that also yourself in the work that you do, that there's more receptivity now to ideas that before would have been seen as perhaps a little utopian, a little leftist, a little this or that. But now there's a receptivity because we know we need it.
Absolutely, and that does feel a moment of hopefulness, but it feels like a small and narrow window, given the dynamics facing us too. And I would love to get into some of this, but perhaps in a part 2 conversation as well. Jane, any reflections from you?
I think the fundamental question for me is actually about what is the role of government? What do populations expect from that role of government? I mean, and I think that depending on what you think government does, depends on what government does. And so for me, it's actually that base of Maslow's hierarchy of need, that government should be keeping their populations safe with the necessities of human existence: clean water, clean air, food, shelter, reproduction. They're all under threat. And actually, just in relation to that last one, a recent epidemiological study that came out of the United States has shown that on the current trajectory, sperm counts are set to reach zero in 2045 because of lifestyle and chemical exposures that are changing and threatening human sexual development and fertility. So humans could become an endangered species. Well, you know, we're collecting all this evidence that says every aspect of our lives are at risk. Now, you can respond to that in one of 2 ways. You can respond to that on the basis, and COVID has shown us this, that humans are social beings. They want to interrelate with each other. They want to look after their families, their communities, their friends. Or you can respond to it by the bunker mentality. But I still hold that, just as Donella Meadows did, that actually, in a sense, a pessimist is of somebody who thinks the worst of people when they first meet them. And an optimist is the person who thinks the best. And I think generally people are good and they will want to help each other get through these crises. And we know that just in the term of any of the disasters that happen, the way communities stand together, the way people step in and help, Now that's at individual level, and we do need action on all levels. We need us as individuals not to just be expecting governments to do all the work, but for us to do that too, whatever we can. We need that in the context of communities, and we need it in the context of governments. And the braver governments are, going back to what Stan was saying about the Paris Agreement. I mean, the Paris Agreement is not online to deliver us with the outcomes we want to see, with the current, what they call nationally determined contributions. So we do need this particular conference of parties in Glasgow this year to be thinking even bigger than that. But if you just look at changes of governments in the US or anywhere else, we're seeing dramatic changes delivered with a change in government. So governments are absolutely key in terms of actually giving out a strong message to their communities about how to keep them safe. And the difference is, it's not government safe in the defense of the realm, the fortress, keep everybody out. It's safe in the context of ensuring that humans, having the right to live in nature, also have the right to have access to the very fundament that keeps them alive and flourishing.
So let's drill down on that perhaps a bit, Jane, around, so we want to see action, and we feel as if there's an opportunity for action, and you're feeling positive about the things that are taking place at the moment. But at the same time, a lot of the ideas that are in both the book and that have been circulated have been around for 40, 50 years. So the question is, like, what are some of the challenges in translating those ideas into the real world? And in particular, you know, what can we do to make that happen? What scale, what entry point should that be taking place at, whether it's at the community, city, nation state level? And perhaps, and this is picking up on a question about the kind of the Wales experience itself, is, you know, you can put a regulatory framework at a certain regional level, but then, you know, how do you make local authorities and decision makers actually understand their responsibilities and act under those duties that they have? And how do you kind of speed up implementation, if you like, at the moment?
Yeah, and it's a really, really important point. But I think one of the reasons I indicated some of the things that has happened at the outset is that I, along with many other people in Wales, would like to see the government move further and faster. I'd like to see all the political parties in the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, be calling on the government to do more. We're still quite a way from all of that. But there are communities out there, there are individuals out there, there are professionals, particularly in the environmental and energy and social fields, who are calling for that. And in the public services in Wales, you have a sort of difference now between some people who've worked in the old systems all their working life, who really struggle to turn this new permission to think differently into something they know how to handle. And then there's perhaps two layers below those. There are officials, the length and breadth of Wales, in every organisation, who are absolutely champing at the bit to deliver on this. So I think that there are, and if we think about the fact that although the legislation was passed in 2015, it wasn't started until 2016. The first step was just for public services to produce plans, and we're only in operational mode in the last 2 years. And one of the big lessons of learning from my book was that this needs to become a People's Act in Wales. You know, the government needs to be brave enough to let everybody know that there is a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act against which people can test their public services, and they can hold those public services to account. And those public services need to be imaginative enough to think not in the constraints that they've always done before, which is to say that an incremental increase is enough. An incremental increase is absolutely not enough, because the very first policy that was only incremental has failed by not being universal. So we're no longer in that moment of incrementalism, and we should be calling out that. We should be absolutely looking at how we can get definite, different delivery on the big challenges facing us, because all the policies we've done so far have patently not been enough. So there's this sort of enormous opportunity for the Welsh decision makers, almost uniquely an opportunity for the Welsh decision makers, just about to be paralleled in New Zealand in terms of the wellbeing economy work there. You said earlier, small countries, Iceland and Scotland and Wales and New Zealand are all part of the Wellbeing Governments Alliance. All of them are actually trying to change and lift that bar. And all of them, by doing so, will lift the bar for others further. And what's really interesting to me in Wales is that although I want things to happen faster, and I'm going to, nudging in or kicking in from the outside as I would to help that to happen, what is really interesting is people are saying, oh, well, they're not doing enough. But actually, it's so much more than anyone else is doing. That is terrifying. So we need Wales to rise to the level of its own ambition so that it can help other countries be even more ambitious. And I can't wait for the next few countries that overtake Wales on this ambition.
Fantastic. As a half Portuguese person, I can say that Portugal is snapping at your heels, hopefully. They've been doing some very interesting work on looking at intergenerational fairness assessment and how can you judge a government's new policy, for example, on whether it mortgages the country's future, it puts a cost onto future citizens, or whether it's a fair policy for generations alive today and in the future. But also Rwanda, Costa Rica, Singapore, Malaysia, there's some just great innovation happening all over the place. And Jane, just another question on this kind of practical point, because there's a couple of questions in the chat around, how do you actually improve your capacity to act and think about different futures, both, I guess, within the government, public policy, using things like foresight teams? Do they help? Do they not? Do they kind of abrogate everybody else's responsibility? And how do you do this as a citizen? You did the Wales We Want exercise. How do we build that capacity to imagine different alternative futures?
I think the point about big exercises in the context of engaging with the public is absolutely critical. Too many governments will do things by focus group, and they will guide their decisions on popularity, and that always has to be short term. Whereas actually, if we're thinking about what we want long term, not just for our children or our children's children, but the children 3-4 generations down the line who we will never meet, I feel I have an obligation, a duty to do my bit to ensure that they still have a habitable world. And therefore, as citizens individually, we have to do things, but governments often have to be helped. And I do think, Kat, that's where the foresight work that you lead on is absolutely critically important in identifying the problem, in looking at what different futures look like. Now, we might know what we want to, and we desire as a future, but we almost have to look at the futures we do not desire in terms of looking at what actions we need to take to contribute towards the futures we do desire. So in a sense, it's, we could say that the Welsh Government, in one sense, is a living example of Stan's Ministry for the Future. But how do you then ensure that the ministries for the future in every country are given the right level of support to enable them to work with their populations to understand how decisions need to be taken and the impact of those decisions further down the line? So one of the elements that does need to happen in Wales a lot more is that there is a mechanism where all the public service leaders are trained in Wales, and that has started intervening on what good delivery against this act looks like. And that needs to be not only rapidly speeded up, but in fact, we need to ensure that we're learning from others across the world in terms of how they're taking this forward as well. Because I think it's that learning that teaches you what you can do in your own culture and circumstance. So I very much am not saying to any country, adopt the Wales model, because the Wales model is a Welsh model. But I'm saying adopt the values framework that led to the Wales model, because then you look at how that values framework can be delivered in your own country. And at this very moment, some of the people on the call, I hope, will be aware that Lord John Bird of Big Issue Frame, the person who has taken the homelessness agenda and campaigning to exceptional levels, and now has the magazine available in 4 continents. You know, John is working with Caroline Lucas MP and the all-party group on future generations to try and take similar legislation forward in the context of England or the UK, but fitting it for purpose in that larger setting. So watch this space, because for me, this can operate as we've tried to do it at university level, at town level, at city level, at city-state level, at nation-state level, at business level. So it's the values framework, and it must be adopted in such a way that people are asked to deliver against a bar that is increasingly raised as we try and deliver better outcomes for future generations.
Thanks, Jane. And Stan, I guess the same question for you, in that you have an encyclopedic view and a really unique perspective, and you work with so many different policymakers from different governments. What's your view on the challenges, but also advice on translating those opportunities into actual practice?
Well, the scientific community has gone off like a fire alarm. And they are insisting on being listened to. And I think that's a process that began in the 1990s. And when the world's community, the economic system, our civilization didn't respond to the early calls from scientists for quick and profound change, especially in our infrastructure base, and which implies our economic system, the scientific community's gotten more and more strident and insistent that something has to be done. That's why the Paris Agreement happened. There you have the diplomatic community, bureaucrats, technocrats, the people essentially hired by government and representing people, citizens of their countries at sometimes 2 or 3 removes from elections, and yet also distanced enough to make long-term decisions and driven by the warnings from the scientific community. So against that, we have neoliberal capitalism. And this is back from the days of Reagan and Thatcher, around 1980, the sense that government is not the solution, government is the problem. This is Reagan's line. There is no alternative to capitalism. That's Thatcher's line. That structure of feeling has dominated to the point where sometimes I worry quite a bit that small countries, a town like my town, Davis, California, even the state of California with the 5th biggest economy on earth, if it were an independent country, they're all on a tide of neoliberal capital that only will invest in the highest rate of return. So people are being paid to do the wrong things for the biosphere and for future generations, extracting profit, et cetera. These indexes are really crucial because we do have to measure. We do have to get a sense of what we want, measure it, and then go for it. So I have in this novel of mine focused on the international level on the Paris Agreement and the central banks as being key to change. There's no possibility of local change that will succeed. There has to be global change that everybody's together with. You could make a perfect Wales, you could make a perfect California, and it would all go down in a global biosphere disaster if we don't change the global system. So here I'm thinking top down. On the other hand, one often talks about bottom up. People's feelings about these things, their values have to change to push their politicians. The right people have to get elected, and then they have to have their feet put to the fire to do what they were elected to do. In the United States, a wicked problem, as a couple of the people in the chat room have noted. The United States system is designed for gridlock. And now that we need to break gridlock, the design is in the way too. So it's a wicked problem. And then I want to introduce the idea, because people always are talking top down, bottom up, of side to side, that it's quite amazing, the relationships between cities, towns, NGOs like your own, of working across borders and through different organizations of different kinds to organize side to side. In the United States, for instance, about 100 million people are living in cities that have made lateral agreements to decarbonize fast amongst themselves, having nothing to do with the national government or even their states. and this includes towns and cities that you wouldn't normally think of as being progressive or being aware of climate, but they are, because nobody's unaware of it anymore. So I think I'm hoping, and I think I see the signs out there, that we are at a tipping point in everything. Our structure of feeling as to what's important. And then, someone once said to me, well, the law always comes last. Everybody has to change their minds before laws get instituted. I'm not so sure that's right. I think it's a feedback loop where both are important. And I do think the laws are being crafted for the first time, like Jane's law, the legislation there that can pick up on people's changed set of feelings, and that we are at this tipping point. And we sure better be, because as the scientists have warned us, we need to decarbonize faster than we are. And if we don't, the catastrophe will follow. So I'm thinking of this Naomi Klein line: this changes everything. The crisis is pushing us into a new state of feelings and of politics, that and of economics, which really, as I keep coming back to, we're going to have to pay ourselves for doing the right thing. That means post-capitalism. Capitalism is a system that was never invented, but merely improvised. And it's a power relation in which the few have power over the many. And the world was regarded as an infinite resource to be exploited at will, including its people. Now, none of that's true. And so a profound change has to come in our political economy. This is really scary, but on the other hand, what must be done can be done. So it's interesting to take it at the most idealistic level and then at the most practical level at the same time. And that's what I'm loving to see in Jane's book and in her career.
Yeah, now I know that we don't have a hard stop, but we are coming up to the hour. And so I'm probably going to ask you one perhaps final question, but I've also noted that a couple of people have asked you about what are other books that have really inspired you to think positively about the future. So if you can kind of think about that and share any thoughts as well, that would be brilliant. But my final question, I guess, to you is that, these ideas, have been around for a long time, but it feels as if the combination of both a COVID-19 moment and also COP26 coming up is perhaps creating the generational opportunity that Guterres, the UN Secretary General, reflected on, or that this is something that we need to seize. What's your views on, your hopes and ambitions for coming out of this year, and in particular around COP26? Perhaps I'll go to Jane first, so I can leave Stan the last word.
Well, I think that the pandemic has done a couple of things which are very important here. The first one is it has given us time to Zoom. My whole days are now in partnership with potentially, up to 20, 30 or more people, basically plotting to take our views to other governments, or in Wales or elsewhere. So I think that opportunity for people to turn a sort of moment into a movement has been absolutely capitalized on through this pandemic. I think the other key thing which I've noticed, and very much living in a rural area as I do, a rural area that doesn't have many services, has been how communities have come together and how businesses have been able to change models very quickly. And what was the norm when we started the pandemic? And I'll just give you a tiny example here, but it's indicative of lots of others. When, our local mill, which restarted after a gap, a heritage mill, so it's a local water flour mill, initially couldn't even get into the shops in the local town of Cardigan, because they had already gone to other mills, mostly of which were in England, because they were guaranteed supply, and they had procurement contracts that then meant that security was going to be there for 5 years or more. But along came COVID, and those were disrupted. And we've got to seize on those disruptions, because those disruptions are the very things that enable new ideas to come through the middle. So now a heritage mill in my village of St Dogmell's is servicing not only the shops round about and the local market, but much more widely as well. And that now is creating new jobs in a local economy, very much linked to what we might call the foundation, that how we make sure that we have enough food, etc. So I think that's that for me are two key lessons from the pandemic. That the big opportunity, what you call a tipping point for disruption, is there. And I just say in the context of the international UN discussions, we don't just have one COP this year. We have two COPs. We have the biodiversity COP in Kunming in China in May, followed by the climate one in Glasgow in November. And it's really important that both COPs are as ambitious as possible. They need to be doing as much rather than the least that can be done. And they need to know that the people of the world are behind them in that. And we know that if we just look at polls of countries, and particularly young people, we know that actually young people, sometimes over 80% of young people in countries, want their governments to act on climate change. And I think we need to give governments confidence to do that by demonstrating that they will be meeting the needs and the aspirations of their population. And at the end of the day, John Rawls, in his Theory of Justice, American philosopher, said, do unto future generations what you would have had past generations do unto you. And I'll just finish with a fantastic quote by Oscar Wilde, since we're talking about utopias, where Oscar Wilde said, a map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at.
Thank you, Jane. Over to you, Stan.
Well, I can't help thinking of another quote by Oscar Wilde. Socialism will never succeed. It takes up too many evenings. But in the Zoom world, maybe you've got the evenings to take. So that may be one effect of the pandemic. But also Pan brings up the thought of panic. The pandemic was a mind boggler for everybody alive. And we know we're in a global civilization right now. We know because of what happened that people getting sick on the other side of the world can completely change your life, that we are interconnected in a profound one planet way. And that's news. That's an oh my God moment that will change people's thinking and lead to the realization that we need fundamental political and economic changes to deal with the reality that we are faced with every day, which is our life in our biosphere as living creatures on a planet of other living creatures. So the pandemic, I think, has been a big shock, and it's also taught us political lessons. Some political entities dealt well with it and are doing better now. Some political entities, countries, nation states had an incoherent response or a denialist response and are now doing poorly. It was like a gigantic lab experiment of let's throw a crisis on the world and see how each nation state responds to it. And you can do comparative analyses of who did well and who did poorly and why. All that matters. And then, inspiring books. Well, this is maybe a chance to finish by evoking the utopian tradition. Plato, Sir Thomas More. In America, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards from the Year 2000, which inspired the great progressive movement of the turn of the last century, and all of the improvements that were made at that time were called out by a utopian novel, really significant politically, even if in literary terms rather bland, let us say. But then H.G. Wells, I mean, he stubbornly wrote utopian novels from 1905 to 1945. And when you think of that span of time, someone stubbornly insisting that things could be better if we took control of our fate, that's really quite an act of utopian willpower. And at Bretton Woods, when diplomats had to construct the post-war order, what did they think of? Well, they thought of H.G. Wells's scientific meritocracy, and with all of its subsequent problems, nevertheless, you can say that utopian literature had once again changed the world. And then now, for me personally, Ursula K. Le Guin was the great leader in American science fiction and in American utopian fiction. And I would just direct people to The Dispossessed as probably the great utopian novel ever written, and inspirational and still amazingly relevant to all the problems that exist now, which isn't really surprising because these are fundamental problems. So those are the books I would point to, along with Jane's as the guidebook, as a kind of how-to guide. This is what you've got to do. And you actually have to settle in for the long march, you know, the battle of the institutions. The long revolution of institutions is not something that you manage to do in 1 year. You have to keep pushing. But maybe this year and, you know, the next one, maybe the 2020s are the year when things are and the decade when things tip towards sustainability over the long haul. And then that will be the new structure of feeling. Everybody at that point will be saying, well, of course we do the right thing for future generations. How could one not? And that will have changed everything.
And that is a lovely vision upon which to leave on, that we all have created a new structure of feeling that, of course, we think about future generations in when we make our decisions. There's been such great chat and questions in amongst the audience. I'm going to propose that we pull together the list of the books that people have recommended, and we're going to circulate it together with the recording of this. Thanks very much for the participants for all your great questions. If you have any thoughts on how to take this forward as well, if you want to continue being on dialogue, Stan and Jane, there's just been some great questions like, what's the best good faith argument against your points of view? I didn't ask that one because I thought we would be here for another hour. Really good points about how do we move away from technological focus to the kind of cultural and governance issues that actually, when we look back, are actually so important in driving the present that we got to. The importance of actually looking at the China, India, Nigerian perspective on this whole debate, given that the future is going to be theirs. So we could have continued for a very long time. Going to get a list of all these questions, and perhaps if you want to respond to any of these or continue in dialogue, then we can certainly do that and organize it. I kind of feel that the people that we've got on the call, we'd love to hear from you. If you've got any thoughts or reflections or topics for another conversation, we'd be very open for this, because, you know, there is a real urgency around this agenda, and there is something about uniting the inspiration that comes from the imagination of literature with the kind of practical experience of the kind of policymakers' knowledge that we've got in this conversation as well. So at that point, I will just say a huge thank you to both audience, and particular to our two fabulous speakers, Stan and Jane. So a big thank you to you all. Thanks to Andrew and Peter for organizing this so effectively, and have a lovely evening to everybody on the call. Thank you.